Welcome on, welcome all to the Politics of Cinema, the show where you guessed it, cinema and politics go hand in hand. I'm Aaron Spears.
And I'm Isaac Miller. And today we are covering 1982's Conan the Barbarian by John Milius. This is the first of our special Nostalgia Pick series in which we choose movies from basically formative movies from our childhoods or maybe early teens or even early 20s and go back to them and judge them and judge ourselves potentially.
Well, so far too, it was like the way we're setting it up is usually it's something that the other person hasn't watched. Like I don't have a nostalgia for Conan. I never watched it until this particular show. I don't know how long that'll last as a bit, but
we'll try it.
Maybe we should also define like nostalgia a little bit too, because this is 1982 and you were like, oh my God, you got to see this movie. I associate it with like your childhood, but that's not the case in this particular case.
I mean, yeah, I wasn't born in 1982. But mind you, like, I don't know, if you were talking about a nostalgia pick for me, that's actually from my childhood. I watched, let's say, E.T. many, many, many times.
Oh, sure.
This is not one of those movies, in fact. This is a cheat. This first nostalgia episode is a lie.
Seems a little harsh, but it's not untrue, I guess.
I first saw Conan the Barbarian in 2011 in Amman, Jordan, on a bootleg DVD, which you could buy in stores in Amman, Jordan. Literally, if you just went down to West Al-Balad, to downtown, and there were whole stores just full of bootleg DVDs acquired by the Russian mob. And
it's like the real-life internet, but a store.
Yeah, it's the real-life internet, but a store. So but this is a formative period in which I was starting to really become. I watched a lot of movies when I was a teenager. My dad had shown me a lot of Kurosawa and classic stuff, and then basically in college I'd stopped watching movies. And this was a period where I started really watching a lot of movies, and I had access to whatever I wanted because literally, like these places had the Criterion Collection. Like it wasn't just popular stuff. Oh no. They had real art things, whole runs of series, like everything was there, depending on which store you were in. I remember, so this is, side note, I remember I was there when the first Avengers came out, and after I saw it in theaters, I wanted to watch it again. So I went to one of these stores because like, it'll be out, right? Like they'll have it.
Yeah.
And basically, this is where I found out where they were getting these ones. They were getting them from the Russian mob. And basically, they said, no, we don't have that. We can't get Disney ones because Disney's security is too tight.
Oh.
Yeah. So the mob could
it's not surprising. It's Disney, but.
Right. Like, the mouse is, yeah. Terrifying.
Wait, so how is that connected to the Russian mob?
Because the Russian mob could not get copies of Avengers.
Oh, it was so tight, even the mob couldn't get a hold of it. Gotcha.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
I think that was what the guy was implying.
Even the Russian mob is scared of Disney's lawyers.
I guess, right? Like, who knows? The death squads? I don't know what they've got under the...
Oh, that's true. Yeah, they are a little harsher than just the law.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's... Anyway, so I watched it then, and I
want to get a full visual here. So when you bought it at this, the bootleg shop, what was the cover art? Was it like better cover art than what we've got with the whole like, Arnold doing the He-Man Masters of the Universe pose? No. I mean, it's just a printed off paper copy of the cover usually. Okay.
They'll literally write in marker what the movie is on the disc.
I love it. It's like me as a teenager burning CDs or movies.
It's totally what it is. And it's been, I haven't been in Amman, Jordan since like, 2015, I think. Somewhere 2015. So I don't know if any of this is still there. Interestingly enough, Cairo, which is the other city where I've looked for bootleg discs, did not, they have some like on the street. They had, at least as far as I'm aware, it's a big city, but I never found, somebody's going to like message and say like, you sucked at finding things in Cairo, which is not wrong. But they, as far as I know, and this sort of surprised me, they didn't have anything quite like this, where it's literally just like a whole like street corner just full of like,
right.
Like Godard movies bootleg. Like who's buying these?
I was wondering, like, there has to be a market though, because like they're there. If they weren't selling, they wouldn't keep stocking them.
It's a sophisticated movie scene. I don't know. It's, obviously, look, there's bootlegs of everything online, anything you want to get. So it makes sense. but it does say something about the Jordanian market that like, yeah, like.
Right, there's only so much shelf space, and if part of that needs to be, Godard films in the Criterion Collection, that warms my heart.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful thing. I'm all for it.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering. So that I wonder how much it's one of those we talked about a little bit with our previous RoboCop episode of like the standard like above ground economy than the black market economy.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder. I hadn't thought about what's going on in the the physical bootleg, like those types of markets. You were just saying in the age where there isn't new stuff coming out into theaters the way it used to be. I wonder what's being bootlegged then.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they've mastered streaming services for some time.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's true.
So it's a lot of the same. It's going to be a lot of the same issues, but there aren't like big hits.
Right.
I mean, it's very hard to figure out. Yeah, I don't know what they're doing.
Maybe their Criterion audience has exploded because they just need new content. Like, well, let's dive into the history here.
Yeah.
So your first impression watching this in Amman was like, fuck yeah, this movie's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing is this movie's fucking amazing. It's ridiculous. It's one of my favorite things, which is an uneven movie. Uneven in a very particular way. Like, what we are combining in this film, and we should talk about the politics of it in a moment, and a little bit about John Milius, is one of the best adventure film scores of all time by Basil Palladorius. Superb set, shooting, the whole deal. James Earl Jones is your villain as a 1,000-year-old sorcerer, leader of a snake cult, cannibal /
also a snake.
Also a snake sometimes, which, fair. Versus Arnold Schwarzenegger, very early in his career. The only other thing, as far as I know, he'd done before this is Pumping Iron. Like, this is what made him a star. He can't act. Like, and we can say Arnold can't act normally or whatever. He's gotten better over the years, but but he really cannot act.
Right.
And basically John Milius, who, writer of Apocalypse Now, a lot of others, contemporary of Spielberg and Coppola and whole crew. So was Basil Palladorius, by the way. He went to school with all of them. Basically casts purely based on appearance, right? Like, why do they cast Jerry Lopez as Subutai? I don't know, because they kept looking for somebody who was sort of like Jerry Lopez but could act, and it's like, well, let's just get Jerry. And it's like, but he can't. Why did he choose Sandal Bergman, as the sort of the female lead for this? Well, because she looked like his idea of a Valkyrie, and he's obsessed with this, right?
Yeah.
So he went with it. She's a dancer. None of these people can act. She's the best of them, but
for sure.
But still not great. So the unevenness of having them up against James Earl Jones, the unevenness of that, it's very clear that actually, I think if you watch this movie enough, you realize that Conan is supposed to in some ways be an intellectual. Like, he's thinking about things. This is nearly a silent movie for a lot of it, and a lot of it is him just contemplating. And an actor who could act to any minimal level could get across the idea that this is someone contemplating fate and destiny, and why am I doing these things? Because that is the level that Milius is operating at. But Arnold Schwarzenegger in 1982 cannot do that in any way, shape, or form. And so here's the thing is, instead of making it outright bad for me, what it makes it is enjoyable to see those cracks.
Oh, okay. I see what you mean.
And also because all the other things about it are enjoyable. And then the other thing that really I love about it is, so Milius is, his other most famous film is Red Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
A right-wing nutball, and known for being so.
Yeah.
He's a history buff, but history buff in the sense of sort of how do I put this? Like dad, war history buff, right?
Like the discount books when there used to be bookstores, the big coffee table ones. It's like the guns of World War II or something. And
yeah, he's that guy, right? But And to give you an example, so like Subutai, who is part of, you know, Conan's backup, you know, his crew. Well, that's the name of one of the Mongol commanders from, you know, Genghis Khan's family, actually, because they're all related, who conquered Russia for the Mongols, like historically. He's into sort of great man history, military history, and the sort of thing that sort of fits into, if you sort of think in terms of 19th century understandings of history, in which race is real, and it's not just black and white race, but it's the European races, right? In which races go out of history, and in
geographical kind of
right, and it's well, but they're
history.
seen as distinct groups, right?
Right,
right, as by blood, and you can find this most clearly now in the fantasy genre, right? If you're looking at Lord of the Rings, races are real, and you see this, you know, and
you got Game of Thrones in there too, and
right. But I mean, especially especially like orcs and goblins and all this stuff.
Right.
That comes out of that 19th century understanding of the world. And, you know, I think Milius, in a sense, comes out of that as well. I mean, this movie starts with a Nietzsche quote.
It sure does.
I mean,
I got to say, as a first timer going into this movie a couple days ago, I wasn't expecting that. And it gave me quite a giggle when it started up. And I was like, you know, I've heard a little bit about Milius. This kind of makes sense.
Right. So his whole philosophy, which I think we should dig into and talk a little more about the direct politics in the text of the film. I think we should combine those two. I enjoy that, not because I agree with any of it, because it's actually antithetical to everything I believe, but because Milius is so gleeful in doing it and because it's so ridiculous. And all of this puts this as actually one of my faves. I can always rewatch this.
So this one, for anybody unfamiliar with the Conan the Barbarian story, young boy Conan becomes a slave after his parents are killed, and his home tribe is destroyed by a savage warlord and sorcerer Thulsa Doom. This was James Earl Jones.
Thulsa Doom.
Thank you. I keep wanting to add that extra U in there for some reason. Thulsa Doom. So then Conan grows up. He becomes a fearless, invincible fighter, set free. Eventually, he plots revenge against Thulsa Doom.
Thulsa.
Did I say it wrong again?
Yeah.
It was a time, not unlike our own, when brutal danger was a part of life. It was in this time that young Conan was orphaned at the hand of Thulsa Doom. And so it became a time for vengeance. But only after his body and his will were shaped by slavery on the wheel of pain could Conan begin his search. First, he had to learn the daring of the thief, the cunning of the fugitive, the bravery of the warrior, the warmth of friendship, the passion of love, and the wisdom of one who has suffered. Only then would Conan understand that revenge is the answer to the riddle of steel. Conan the Barbarian, a film by John Milius.
So yeah, that plot, I remember this video box. It was always staring at me, like as a kid, and also once I was working at a rental store back in the day. It was rented a lot. I remember we had we called a live store, where the cassette tape you wanted to rent was behind the box. So like I remember putting this tape behind the box a lot. It rented a ton. I never watched it. I never gave a shit about Arnold. I think I've seen maybe 4 Arnold movies over the years. Let's say 6. I'm sure I'm missing some in there. This is not, looking at the imagery, the art, the artwork on the cover of the box, reading that description, knowing what it's about, does not scream overtly to me, hey, this is a political film.
Mm-hmm.
But within moments of hitting play, maybe it's just the concept of the podcast we're doing, I was, kind of looking for it, obviously. Within moments of like the Nietzsche quote, and then his dad starts talking about the myth,
the riddle of steel.
The riddle of steel, and I was like, okay, there's something going on here.
Yep.
I was not expecting that. I mean, I was expecting it because I know you. So then going into this film knowing like, oh, it's an early Conan movie, or it's an early Arnold movie. It's the movie that kind of made Arnold, became a huge hit. I knew that Arnold was in it, and I knew that you loved it. I knew Milius directed it, and I knew that Arnold punches a camel at some point. That was it going into it. But politically, though, it does start off right away, kind of like we said with RoboCop and Starship Troopers on our previous episode. Politics are kind of right there and right up front in the first 10, 15 minutes.
Right. Except absolutely opposite. Right. Whereas those are savage satires, this is completely serious.
It's almost exclusively serious.
Right.
I think to its detriment, but we'll get into that as we go here.
This is actually, let me just say, saying it that way is another reason that I love it, which is I do not go with the so bad it's good or whatever. If it's good, it's good. But we can also say that something is not of technical quality. Part of what makes a movie work in that way, in a certain sense, and I think part of it is, I mean, this movie's production quality is also too high, I think, to really quite fit in that. But part of is the fact that it takes itself totally seriously. Like, Milius cares deeply for this. I listened to the commentary with him and Arnold, which is almost unbearable for large parts of it, just because Arnold is just sitting there going like, oh, that's when I do this. And it's just like, yeah, we know, we can see you do it. But the level of enthusiasm that Milius still has for every single thing in there, and just explain, this meant this, and this meant this, this meant this. And it's like, we get it. It's not even that deep, but like, I love that you love it.
Commitment to the bit.
Yeah, it's the passion comes through for me.
Yeah.
This is a movie where somebody cared.
Right.
And it comes through. It doesn't necessarily work completely, but once again, that's part of the charm, I guess, for me.
No, I see it. I feel it the way you talk about this movie. I feel that for certain movies, it's just not this movie.
Yeah. So what was the politics for you? Like, let's talk a little bit about what the politics of this movie are.
Well, I was trying to separate out from what I know about Milius or whatever, or obviously Arnold, because Arnold, as we know him now, that's not the Arnold we're watching in this particular movie. It definitely had the whole idea, actually kind of out of Starship Troopers, like the level of fascism we were talking about with Starship Troopers on our last episode, of the idea that strength is it. That's all that counts. Yeah. Is clearly there right away. Like the riddle of the steel, which you can get into a bit more than I can, because you've thought about this more than I have, which was pretty much just while I was watching it, and then a couple of notes I wrote. But he's like, might and muscle personified, and that's what's going to get him through this life. The riddle of the steel I thought was interesting because it ends up running almost as an interesting counterpoint once he gets up and James Earl Jones gives a speech of like, no, flesh is actually the strongest part, and they get into that kind of interesting back and forth. It's
the hand that wields it, right? There's a whole philosophical argument in this, which if there had been a better actor than Arnold, we could have actually gotten effectively. Sure. Right. If there had been somebody who could actually go back and forth with, I mean, one of the things I like about this movie is that there's so little talking, but when they're, there's whole scenes. There's a scene in the eve of the climactic battle in which Arnold is talking about if his fate had ever been different. And he is putting every last bit of concentration that he has.
He is trying so hard in that scene.
He is really trying. It doesn't work, but I appreciate the effort.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, also knowing its time, this is 1982. This is the early-ish days of, it's the early days of Reagan, and kind of what he did to rewrite kind of political norms and political ideologies in this particular country. So I was like I was trying to be aware of like the ideas of like individualism, like that's pretty much a huge thing here. But also, I don't know too much about the history of the Conan character. You told me a little bit, which we can get into later on here. You told me a little bit about where it comes from. I honestly, in my head, I've given it no real thought about Conan. I just thought it was like, they wrote this movie, it became a big thing. So then there were some comic books around, there were some offshoots, there was some straight to video stuff, there was a sequel. I didn't realize how much of a history there was. So I don't know how much of the history and the political history that Milius was drawing on to do this particular story, but it definitely has some strong whiffs of that 80s Reagan rugged individual, up by your bootstraps and whatnot.
So I'll say this. So, I mean, the thing, Conan goes back to the 20s or the 30s, and, as a pulp novel character, famous for 60s and 70s, I think mainly 70s, art by Frank Frazetta, and comic books, Marvel Comics actually, and lives on, especially right now in the comics. There's an effort a few years ago with Jason Momoa to make another one. I've heard rumors that Netflix is going to pick it up. I mean, it makes sort of sense, right? I think, the original author was friends with, H.P. Lovecraft, so that may tell you something. I've never read the original books. I had a very dear friend who was a fan. Actually, was a major fan. I've always meant to read them because of her. She actually, unfortunately, was murdered about 10 years ago, and I've always sort of meant to read them sort of in her honor. I can't speak to what the politics are. My impression, because I've never read the original novels, my impression is that this is Milius. That this is really his vision to a large extent.
Oh, it's his thing. Okay, yeah, his version. Just use the vehicle of Conan.
Yeah, he's using the vehicle of Conan to do what he wants to do. Conan is a perfect vehicle for him, for his view of the world. And to address sort of the element there, I think you're connecting this to Starship Troopers is dead on in this sense. So if you look at reviews, contemporary reviews of this was considered fascistic.
Yeah.
I don't think it is. I was actually talking with another political movie friend of mine yesterday, and we were talking about Conan, and it's not fascistic, but what it is taking from the same well of sort of that of the strength, right makes right, strength over all else. But in fact, I think the film actually undermines that significantly throughout, and I think that the underlying sort of his story in some ways complicates it. And just to point out why, first off, is literal physical strength, right? It's actually will, ultimately, because the thing that his father tells him at the beginning of the movie about not trusting anything but the steel of the sword, basically, you cannot trust beasts or women or men or anything else, turns out to be completely untrue. Because
that's a good point.
His comrades in this movie are
save him several times,
are as strong as he is. He is never shown to be more capable than they are, including our female lead. Valyria is, though a very attractive woman, is not really shot for TNA by and large, but is a savage killer who has her own arc in the film. She actually has a total arc in the film in which she, to the best of conveying this, falls in love with Conan. He falls in love with her. These are two people who've never had anything in their life. She's actually literally never had sort of like a deep connection with someone. When he chooses vengeance over being with her, she goes, saves him, and then sacrifices her life to make sure that he doesn't die by being cursed by the gods, by basically protecting him while they're resurrecting him with magic, and dies doing so, but satisfied for doing so, and through her own agency. So issues around like fridging or something. I mean, she doesn't die. She does this as part of her. I don't know. It's like, it's completely. I mean, one could say by modern standards, this is still somewhat regressive in some ways, but honestly, like,
not for 82, I don't think. You kind of have to think of
not for 82 by any means, and I don't know even today completely in a certain sense. But it's a complete arc that makes sense emotionally.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I wrote in my notes at one point that I was like, actually, I wrote, this movie sucks. Arnold sucks. I want more Valyria. Why can't we just follow her story? It's far more interesting.
I get it.
I was feeling it at one point because she's able to emote. And like you said, these aren't like, classically trained, actor studio actors. But in comparison, like her performance is out of the park because she's, next to Arnold for all of it. And when she's clearly like, I'm like, oh, it looks like she generally has affection for this guy. And you look over on the left side of the screen and it's him. And you're like, I can't tell what he's doing. Is he like making eggs? Is he waiting for his food to dine? Like, I don't know what he's doing. He's not emoting anything.
He is a black hole in this. But here's the thing is, so, all right. So that level, the individualistic strength doesn't hold up. The actual comradeship is actually what gets him through. Secondly, it is, like you say, Thulsa Doom is actually correct in that it is not the steel And it is not even the muscle. It is the will that is the ultimate strength, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the movie, Conan is able to overcome the hypnotizing capacity that Thulsa Doom has, which he actually used on Conan's mother originally and kills her that way, and is able to decapitate him perfectly, and then throw his body and corpse onto the stairs.
Oh, that's what he was doing.
Yeah.
Because like he's just staring at her, and I was like, I need some, like, what are they doing? Do they know each other? What's going on here? And then she just like drops her sword. Okay. They needed a better sound effect or something, because that was not coming across to me.
But part of it is, I mean, that scene is a deeply contemplative scene where Thulsa Doom has basically... So think about this. This is an anticlimax of a scene, right? The final battle has already happened. They just have a showdown of wills.
Mm-hmm.
Conan kills him. But Thulsa Doom's argument that I have made you, I am your father as much as your father was, is completely true. And so the next scene is basically...
what do I do now?
Yeah, Conan sitting there contemplating what his next fate is going to be, deciding when it's going to be. No one's saying anything, because if you had an actor that could actually convey this on their face, you would know. And
right.
Then walking off. It's all there. It's actually incredibly deep and very different from your normal action or whatever. But philosophical. So, this is one again the unevenness that I love. Because that's what's supposed to be happening.
It's all there if you're willing to do the work that the actor clearly isn't capable of doing.
Right. If you look at everything else around them, about what the music is doing, the lighting, everything. But so part of it is yes, strength is the ultimate. But what is strength is sort of troubled in that, and it's not the fascistic answer. Well, so here's my question for you. All right, our villain is a Jim Jones style hippie cult run by a 1,000-year-old sorcerer who is actually a cannibal and eating you. This is from 1982. It's pretty clear what's being inspired. This is what's inspiring all this.
All right, hang on. Wait, one quick question to interrupt real quick. You mentioned a cannibal, I think, twice now. It was like, what part? I've only gone through this movie once. Did I miss?
Yes.
A cannibal. Oh, the soup.
Yep,
the stew
the
thing.
soup.
Oh, okay, at the orgy. Gotcha.
Yeah, the soup at the orgy.
There was a skull and a hand. Okay, yeah. Okay, sorry. Go ahead. I forgot about that detail.
If you actually look more closely, when they first get into the cave, there's actually people hanging up like on meat hooks.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they're eating people. It's a
gotcha. Okay, yes. Cannibal, Jim Jones cult. Yes.
Yeah, in which there's literally scenes in which it's very clear there are a bunch of hippies saying, "Return to the earth. Give up your individuality, give yourself up to nothingness," and the film is saying, "Fuck you, strength." But it's nonetheless the strength of actually relying on your friends. It's actually not a pure individualism, right? It's real bonds based on shared sacrifice, and people who will literally go to save you and then try to convince you to give up on vengeance because it's destroying you. Like,
well, I think that's sort of there. I'm saying from Conan's perspective, though, like he has he still dedicates himself to vengeance, even if he has to go it alone as an individual. That's their decision to go find him and help him out. And then like he's being, crucified, and he gets cut down, and then she saves him. She even saves him as a Valkyrie ghost something at the end.
Right.
But he is still hell-bent on the vengeance, and I'm doing this even if I have to go it alone. So I think there's an individualism streak within Conan, even though his friends feel it a bit more collectively the whole way through. I think he gets there possibly by the end, but it's a little too late because, they don't all make it.
Well,
but I think he still has an individualism focus.
Well, he does, and part of it is when he tries to do it alone, he fails.
Right.
And then they crucify him on the tree of woe, and then he kills a buzzard with his teeth.
I'm sorry. This is why fantasy isn't always my genre.
I
forgot it was called the Tree of Woe, but it was, and it is full of woe. You're being crucified. That's woe.
I see. I can't get out of. I mean, that is definitely woe. Okay, like that. You are deep in woe if you're being
deep in woe if you're being
crucified.
Tree. Yeah.
And so here's the other thing. One of the reasons that I love this is I have underneath all this, I'm a comic book fan, and I'm aware of what comics come out of, and I love pulp. Right. I love the pulpy ridiculousness. And this is a movie that takes that, just doesn't back away from it. Anyway, I think just sort of the politics of it is, I think it is a completed statement because this is Milius and he is attempting to do that. I don't know if I completely agree with his own take on his statement, but I think, there's the elements that go into this sort of hyper violent fascism that you see, or the hyper, the fascistic attitudes that we saw in our last episode, in
Starship Troopers.
In Starship Troopers, but I don't think that's ultimately what's being done here. Really,
no. It was like an easy shorthand because we were just discussing it.
But I do think this is a warmongering, like ultimate, ultimately sort of great man history version of history,
right?
In which, the capacity for violence ultimately wins out, but in the end leaves you with a hollow feeling and a sense of emptiness because your purpose is gone.
Yes. Well, because he had dedicated his life to, vengeance rather than like a life well lived, or, the affection he feels towards Valyria or anything like that.
Right.
So it depends on where you want to put your priorities, I guess. And if you put your priorities on, like the individual quest for vengeance, then you're going to be left feeling a little hollow.
But,
by the end,
like I said before, most movies like this at this level would not be showing that as their final scene.
So let me ask you a question then, again, with kind of sticking with the politics of it. In reading this with an 82 reading of it, is there parallels, or does this work as a parable for Reagan and the Soviets and the new Cold War that was shaping up?
Oh, I didn't ever thought of that. I mean, I'm sure not intentionally, but it's just
part of the culture in which, Milius is there, and he's a politically aware adult when he's writing this. I'm just wondering what kind of, I'm not saying like James Earl Jones is necessarily like, his base is the Kremlin or anything like that, but I'm just kind of wondering the public perception of what like Soviet society was a lot of, I don't know, looking at it now, like it's a lot of like high camp and propaganda. Is there anything that's analogous between the James Earl Jones snake cult and whatever the public perception was of Soviet society and politics at the time?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it's certainly. I'm not sure. I don't know if the parallel. I mean, if anything, this is more a movie about killing hippies.
That old story. I mean, yeah, it's 82. It's still, like we said, like it's still the culture is still. The popular culture via film is still processing the transition out of the hippie culture into disco, then into the fucking 80s at this point. So I can see Milius being one of those people that's like, you know what, we need to kill some more hippies.
We're going to do enough 80s movies that you like the 80s.
Well, I have a separate topic I'm going to discuss in a different show about the 80s that I've been kind of taking a look at, but we'll see. I'm finding them more of an interesting intellectual curiosity than I was maybe 3 or 4 months ago. I'll give it that for now.
But no, I think I think it is another one of these movies where you're digesting the effects of the 60s and early 70s in a lot of ways. And this is where it fits with Reagan, because it is a movie of the counterattack to that, right? Like the underlying values are very much sort of right-wing self-reliance values, even if actually there's a collective element to it.
Right.
And militarism and so forth. And, and ultra masculinity. Like hyper masculinity.
Yeah.
So it's, all those go into it. It's clearly, I think, a film of the 80s and the Reagan counterattack. At the same time that I think that there's a lot of interesting things going on that you could, quibble. I mean, a lot of this is, what do you know about John Milius? Like I said some things.
Oh, not that much, to be honest. I mean, I know he's around the new Hollywood, which anybody who's listened to more than a few episodes know that's my favorite time period in American film history, the late 60s, early 70s. And you don't get some of the highlights without Milius kind of behind the scenes. I didn't really get too much into his particular personal politics because, as I think I tended to focus more on the directors of that time period, not as much on the screenwriters. But I mean, he's around some of my favorite filmmakers of that era. Jeremiah Johnson, I know he wrote that one, and that was one of those movies I found later on when I was doing a deeper dive into 70s stuff that ended up being a favorite. Which I think that's a really interesting possible parallel with, like you were saying, the way Conan is kind of what were you saying, like the hero man of history?
Oh, just sort of a great man of history.
The great man of history. I think that's sort of an early working of that kind of narrative trope, the quest narrative, if you will. So personally, not too much. I just know that he's around a lot of my favorite filmmakers when they were starting out. But I think his career just went in a different direction that I just wasn't interested in. So I never really did much of a real look at him.
I mean, I knew him best because of Apocalypse Now, which I mentioned. He also wrote Quint's famous speech about the about the sharks.
Jaws.
In Jaws. They literally called him up. I think I have the story correctly, they called him up on set. Like he wrote that like right there, I think.
I've definitely heard that story. I don't know how true that is, but that is the lore for that one for sure. Yeah.
And it's a very Milius thing, right? It's totally stuff he would know.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to cover Red Dawn at some point.
Sure.
There's no way we're not going to. Quintessential second Cold War 80s movie.
But somehow without any Chuck Norris in that one. It's very strange.
Well, it's because it's the teenagers.
Yeah. No, I think it's the... also the Dirty Harry, I think, too, right? Didn't he have a hand? Even maybe... Was he uncredited on that one?
I don't know. That wouldn't surprise me because that's... Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was the 80s once I was getting into film. Like he was popping up more as like the Red Dawn Conan guy. And then I knew of him as being kind of like around the 70s with some of the stuff I was watching in the 70s.
But he is in a lot of ways sort of an interesting, quote unquote, reactionary force.
Yeah.
I mean, and I just, like that in itself is sort of interesting because you can learn a lot from that. You can learn a lot from someone like that because here's the thing is this. I mean, God, 80s Hollywood and 90s, is really, 80s action movies. This stuff is really, really bad. And the philosophy is really upfront. And it's, politically, this is a very reactionary time and you can tell. But I actually think that Conan is an unusually interesting, and I've sort of argued, contemplative text in that era by the standards. Those buddy cop movies are real dumb,
Oh, yeah, yeah. But it was also, I mean, that speaks a little bit to the Verhoeven thing we were talking about last episode, where like maybe is that just like the Hollywood trope, like that style of screenplay that he's just kind of playing around in that kind of genre, if you will, because it's a bankable formula that knows is going to work.
I mean, I think for this, no, this is because this is what he wants. I think
this is what he wanted to, yeah, for sure.
I mean, I think in this area, this is what he is. I mean, I think that you could say, I mean, you've seen the original Red Dawn?
No.
Okay, if you watch
the remake for whatever reason, I don't know why I did that one.
We should pair those two. That would be really interesting because it tells you can say a lot with that. But the original one is very much him, and it's ridiculous. It's about guerrilla warfare with high school students in the Rockies because the Soviet Union and Russia and the Cubans have invaded and taken over half of America, and so now the tables have turned. Right, we're really dealing with all of our issues from Vietnam now.
Yeah,
but you can tell at a superficial level, at his sort of like, sort of the honor of warriors level, that he's thought about guerrilla warfare. Like the main antagonist in that film is a Cuban commander who was a guerrilla fighter in Cuba, and so he's not a bad guy. He can totally empathize with the Americans fighting a guerrilla war against him. So like John Milius is like sort of, I mean, to me, to a certain degree, it is like this sort of, I don't know, superficial sort of like honorable warrior kind of attitude of history, and it, or attitude about politics that is bullshit, but also can make some interesting movies.
Sure.
Not really good ones.
Do you, but I think we've tossed the term around here, but you're saying, does he fall into that reactionary political mindset, you think?
I think he does, but I think he thinks it through more.
Okay. So I have a quote from Milius that I brought from Film Threat magazine. This is from 1999, just so we're talking about, what time period he was saying this in. He said, quote, sorry, we get my laughs out now. Quote, "I'm not a reactionary. I'm just a right-wing extremist so far beyond the Christian identity people like that and stuff that they can't even imagine it. I'm so far beyond that I'm a Maoist. I'm an anarchist. I've always been an anarchist. Any true, real right-winger, if he goes far enough, hates all form of government because government should be done to cattle and not to human beings."
All right.
There's a bit there, isn't there?
there's a lot going on there. I mean, he doesn't say. I mean, when he says he's he doesn't say he's a libertarian, but that sort of fits, right? Like
That's what it sounds like more to me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's like a hardcore right-wing libertarian, I guess. But it's yeah. I mean, that fits with the individualism. That fits with even almost a chosen family. I mean, this is where the sort of fascistic, the other sort of side of the fascistic element comes in. So there's there's this sort of glorification of warfare and violence, which I haven't quite said it that way, but that's actually what's going on here. There's the hyper individualism, which is not traditional fascism at all, but does fit deeply with sort of the American far right. And then finally, there's the comment about Christian identity once again fits with that sort of like faux history of, sort of pagan warlords and whatever, which fits perfectly with Conan, right? Which also, if you're not careful, will lead you into actual Nazi territory and their fantasies about, Norse gods or whatever. And yes, This is a man who, if you listen to this, is very much into Vikings and Norse stuff. He's not a Nazi, as far as I can tell.
Right.
And he's not actually a fascist, but he's in that.
I don't know. He's
realm.
He's on the path, even if he's not fully there.
He's in the family.
Yeah. So as we tend to do, I looked up a couple of critic quotes from this time period, like contemporary ones, and I read a couple that were bad, but I didn't feel like they were very well argued, just because I was like, I wasn't really a huge fan either. But I found one, Ebert, because he's come up quite a bit on the show, Roger Ebert. So at the time this movie came out, one of the things that you'd mentioned was how you're like, the casting is ideal because that's all he was doing was getting the look down for this movie. And Ebert agreed. He said he thought the movie's casting is ideal. Arnold Schwarzenegger is inevitably cast as Conan, and Sandal Bergman as Valyria. Physically, they look like artists' conceptions of themselves. It's just like basically what you were saying, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and I'm getting this directly from Milius. Milius just says it over and over again in all, any interview or whatever.
Yeah. So Ebert also, he has actually one complaint, which actually, no, complaint's the wrong word. He even mentioned, he's talking about James Earl Jones and how he brings power and conviction. He says actually power and conviction to a role that seems inspired in equal parts by Hitler, Jim Jones, and Goldfinger. But when Conan and Doom meet at the top of the mountain of power, it was, for me, this is Ebert talking, a rather unsettling image to see this Nordic Superman confronting a black man, and when Doom's head was sliced off and contemptuously thrown on the flight of stairs by the muscular blonde Conan, I found myself thinking that Leni Riefenstahl could have directed the scene and that Goebbels would have also applauded. Am I being too sensitive? Perhaps. Which is, within his right to observe it that way, but he doesn't give Conan a negative review because he felt this way, because he says that this is one aspect of the film that disturbed him. He's not saying that it was poorly made or this ruined the movie for him. He's just saying, he's talking about his personal reaction to it, and even admits at the end, am I being too sensitive? Yeah, perhaps. But he's also just letting the viewer know, like, this was my reading of this particular scene, which I feel like lesser critics finds one scene like that they didn't like or they found distasteful, and then that ends up becoming all they focus on in their review. This way, Ebert mentions a personal thing that came up in the film that did disturb him. Am I being sensitive? Perhaps. And he moves on to the next point. He doesn't let it ruin the whole movie. He's just letting the viewer know, because he's a great writer. Here's how I was processing all the stuff going on in this movie. Here's a scene if you want to think about. Isn't that weird?
I mean, it's certainly, I don't think it's an intentional part of the text. As in, I don't think that's the message. I mean, I think James Earl Jones is there to be this figure, and I don't think that fits into any of our sort of the standards ways that racism, anti-black racism works, right? Like, this is not a character that fits any of that. But it certainly is an image.
I was going to say, yeah, again, I feel like you have to lead in with what Milius has already said he was doing, which is he's casting people for their looks. But in the case of James Earl Jones, you also get someone who can act, and that guy has got gravitas to spare. So if you're going for like, I need someone to be a cult leader, you don't cast Conan or you don't cast Arnold to be the cult leader.
Right, you can't.
No one's going to be able to understand what the fuck he's saying, and he has no charisma to actually involve anybody into his cult. Like James Earl Jones, as soon as he like rides on that horse and has that awesome ass helmet on in the opening scene, you're like, oh, this guy is in charge.
Right. He's an absolute, he's a great actor. And he can project all this stuff. I don't know if he was cast in the same way. Like, I think he may have been cast because you needed an actor for this role.
Sorry, that was the end of my thought to that one. Thank you. Was the idea like he not only does, he physically is there, and you never think of he and Arnold. Like I've never thought of James Earl Jones and Arnold as being like muscular equals, if that makes sense physically. But in this movie, James Earl Jones physically commands the scenes that he's in with Arnold away from him because he is able to act. And when you have someone who's the cult leader in your movie, that's about just a 1,000-year-old snake cult, like you need to have some charisma beyond just like, oh, you look like a cult leader. Like, no, he carries himself like a cult leader.
Right. Yeah, he can totally do this. I mean, his speech about flesh and steel is right. Yeah. I mean, one of the things is, I mean, his henchmen in this movie, and him. I mean, all of them. There's casting meant to make Arnold look small. Now, Arnold is actually not particularly tall, but he's a big guy if you shoot him right. And but what they did is they like traveled around and found the biggest like Danish weightlifters they could find, and a massive ex-football player. So they tower over Arnold, and that's completely intentional because they're trying to make it look like, yeah, Arnold Schwarzenegger is like this perfectly toned machine, but look at what he's up against.
Right.
Which is smart casting. Once again, people who you can't give lines. Like, you really can't.
No.
I mean, there's basically like Max von Sydow in like one scene having a lot of fun.
But he's also sitting in a throne and he's up tall as well.
Right.
Okay, you know what? Wikipedia says that Arnold Schwarzenegger is 6'2", which is like my height.
Okay, well, and I'm not that. So, all right.
I'm just saying, like, how big are these bodybuilders then that are like the two henchmen for James Earl Jones if they're like towering over a 6'2" guy?
I see rumors that they're at least 6'5". They're huge guys.
Yeah, they're huge. Yeah.
And then, they're also just muscle too. So it's like,
well, then, I was saying that muscle, but then also the visual trickery that you can do with like, camera ends and depth of field and the way the angles you shoot at to make them look even more overbearing and huge.
Before we wrap up, I want to mention the score and my questions that I should have looked into, frankly. The 80s has, this is the height, except maybe now, who knows? I don't know. I'd like to see the height of the cultural impact of D&D. And also, and the fantasy genre in general. There are many, many obvious Conan ripoffs, and then a lot of other fantasy films in the 80s. And my impression has always been that Conan was the progenitor of a lot of this. I could be completely wrong, and I have not timed it out. I've not looked around. I don't know.
Right.
But it's certainly influential on what came afterwards. Deeply influential.
Well, again, because also this movie had I would say modest-ish to a little bit high budget for the time period. I think it was like 30 million or so. And you can tell like it's on screen in practical effects. This is not a CGI filled, fantasy epic. This is done with actual effects. And it was made for 20 million, grossed about 80 million when it first came out, which is, a sizable hit. But this is also, again, this is the quick VHS reminder that this was the era when it came out. Like it found a waiting audience in the rental market as well. That became huge.
I mean, it couldn't have been CGI, but they don't even there are only so many you don't have a lot of like lightning bolts and stuff. You have some, but it's not.
Oh yeah, that's true.
There's a lot of physical stuff here. There's really lavish sets. There's some beautiful miniatures. Like I think the cities when they're riding up to the miniatures. I honestly, it's a reminder that I really wish they use those a lot more because it works better than the CGI when it's done well. And they can do it better today.
No, I just wanted that reminder where like, I think even if it wasn't like the start of the kind of like kickoff for serious fantasy at that point in time, it was it's a huge milestone in tracking that through the 80s.
But yeah, so the other thing about it is that, I mentioned that this is one of the best adventure scores of all time by Basil Palladorius. Mm-hmm. I will stand by that. It's incredible. It's really it's a classic, it is a classic feel to it. It conveys emotion much better than most of the actors on the screen. And does that
well, someone's got to do the work. I mean,
somebody's got to do the work, and the score does the work.
Right?
Apparently, he had an unusual amount of time to do it, like more than usual. He really, I don't know. I mean, we're gonna have some clips of it. It just kills. It's just so good. I'm not like a big music person, so I can't explain every single thing that it's doing. But honestly, if you Google the score, you can find people, serious music film sites going piece by piece.
Yeah. Well, it's an inadvertent theme because, and when we were looking him up, because you're like, oh my God, this score. I was like, well, let's look this guy up, see what he was doing. He did the score. He worked with Paul Verhoeven. He did the score for RoboCop, and he did the score for Starship Troopers. See the episode right before this one that we just put out. So like he's been around some of the stuff we've been discussing already without us really even realizing it.
See, and this is, I mean, what I've read about this is that this is like sort of his standout score of his life. I can kind of tell because I like the music. Here's the thing is, I like the music in both of those movies. And knowing now that it's them, I can that it's him in all three, I can kind of tell. But this is so distinctive comparatively.
Well, he also did 84's Red Dawn. So if we tackle Red Dawn at some point, keep your ear out for that score as well.
This is the unintentional Basil Palladorius, fan podcast.
That's a very niche market. But if you think about it from the standpoint of like how we're looking at films with this particular podcast, he's got Conan on his list. He's got Red Dawn, Iron Eagle from 86, the Louis Gossett Jr. action film. I watched most of that series again, video store. Thank you. RoboCop, Hunt for Red October, Starship Troopers. He did a Les Mis score in 1998. He's around a lot of, I don't know, like oddly political Hollywood action films from the 80s
and 90s.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, and in through the 90s, yeah, too. So he did RoboCop 3, as you mentioned, previous episode. Your introduction to the RoboCop universe. He was there doing that score as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, this, yeah, I've heard a fair number of those, but this one is just, yeah. When I need to get pumped up to do something, it's either Rocky or this.
I think somebody with some musical knowledge should do a little like dream analysis into what your musical selections are when you need to get pumped up. See what's going on there.
I prefer they not, but
no, all right.
What does it say that despite everything I believe and even what my favorite movies are, when I need to get pumped up, it's just like giant 80s muscle men blowing people up.
Right. I don't know. Good scores, I guess. Gets the blood pumping, gets you excited. It's musicians that know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Or composers, I guess, who know what they're doing. All right, I think that'll wrap up our trip down memory lane on this particular nostalgia episode. I'm glad I did watch Conan, Isaac. I was giving you some shit on the show and privately some shit via text as we were talking about this after I watched it. It took me a couple tries to get through it. I don't know what I was really expecting, to be honest. It didn't work its magic on me the way it worked its magic on you. That's fine. Everybody's got their own tastes. So we'll see what nostalgia trip I want to inflict on you next time we're doing a nostalgia pick. But until then, what have we got up for our next episode if anybody wants to watch along with us?
Yeah, so we are going to be tackling Steve McQueen's new film which is out on Amazon, which is part of his 5-part Small Acts series about the sort of the Black community and specifically the West Indies community in Britain and its history. It's very exciting. Steve McQueen is a major auteur, and it's really fun to see him tackling political themes, which of course he's done throughout his career. So we're going to be, I believe, following that series as it opens. We're not every episode, but we'll be coming back to it and work our way through it.
Well, also because he's pitching this not as a Amazon like TV series. It's a collection of 5 films, is the way he's calling it. And we thought it'd be interesting to take a look at this because there isn't a theatrical release environment right now that this could be in, that movies can be going to right now. It's such a I don't even know what's going on. So now you have major international film auteurs that are working with streaming platforms to get their content out to viewers. So we're, still very much a dedicated cinema podcast. And Steve McQueen has said, this is a collection of 5 films. So it just happens to be that we're going to be streaming it instead of going to see it on the big screen, which I would much rather do for a Steve McQueen film, or a collection of films for that matter as well. But it's also, I really like this format. It's almost like it's serializing these films and these stories he wants to tell. This isn't we're dropping it all on one date on a streaming platform the way you would do normally on Netflix or on Amazon or any Hulu or whatever. This is one film a week from a major international auteur, like you said, diving deep into political history. I think it spans what is like from 69 to the 80s, I think.
Right.
like you said, in the London's West Indian community. So I'm looking forward to it because I would assume I'd have been seeing his next film on the big screen. So I'm glad that we have instant access to it on a weekly basis. We'll
yeah, I mean, this gives me a good reason to dig more deeply into the political history of that period. It's a very important period in British history, leading into the Thatcher period or the early Thatcher period, right? Which is the parallel to Reagan.
Yeah.
So this is going to be interesting.
And it's British. You get a British fix in here, Isaac. Come on.
I get my British fix in here. And well, here's the other thing: we have not done a contemporary movie, and by contemporary,
that was part of it too.
Yeah, we haven't done a contemporary movie, as in one that was from the 21st century, for I don't know how long. I mean, since
we did some art house horror picks, but we haven't done anything like
that's true. All right,
of the moment itself.
We haven't done anything of the moment itself, and so that's exciting. We're getting back in.
Yeah, absolutely. So also be sure if you rate and review the show wherever you're listening to this, whatever podcast app you are enjoying. And if you do like the show, tell a friend or two. We're also up and running on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. So follow the links in the show notes on whatever device it is you're listening to our voices right now. And until next time, I am Aaron.
And I'm Isaac. Stay safe out there.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please come back again soon. Good night.